Welcome. My name is John Fumey. I'm the executive director here at the Akron Art Museum. I do have to just say that the first 3 rows, they're safe. They are safe. It's, so you're still close to an exit, all that great stuff, but definitely take advantage of that. But what an incredible evening this is. I couldn't be more excited than to be asked to welcome all of you here, both our friends from the community, but also all of the participants of the CAR program. This is really exciting, and I want to, first of all, thank Christy Bolingbroke for inviting us to participate in this. Absolutely incredible. Have really enjoyed getting to, I personally have enjoyed getting to know more about the NCC program and how important it is, not only here in Akron, Ohio, but across the country. Along the same lines, I have to mention that I really love the purpose of this program, how it encourages you to think outside traditional boundaries and to really get creative. And I really, really hope that all of you will generate incredible ideas this weekend through your exposure to the absolutely awesome community here in Akron. And hopefully, visual arts organizations will be part of those conversations in the future. So please do not forget about us as well, because the crossover between dance and visual art is absolutely amazing. And I have a friend here in the audience who has actually participated in the past, and Dominic has just really been a fine example of that. So pick his brain too, please. But again, really excited to be here. As Christy made mention, for those of you that were over at the dinner, the galleries will remain open, I think, till 9 o'clock tonight. We have an incredible exhibition of the Keith Haring, which I saw more of you in the gift shop, I think, than in this room. But along those same lines, our collection galleries have just been reset with just some absolutely stunning artwork from across the country as well. And then I'd love to give a great shout out to the phenomenal staff here at the Akron Art Museum. So both Caitlin and Jeff, who you're going to meet here on the stage this evening, is definitely just does an awesome job. And of course to the staff of NCC as well. So again, thank you very much for being here, and welcome.
Over there? Danger. They let me out from behind the podium. For those that don't know me, my name's Christy Bolingbroke. I'm the Executive Artistic Director for the National Center for Choreography here in Akron, Ohio. Yes! NCCAkron was established in 2015. We are thrilled with all that we've been able to do, and it feels extra special to be able to have all of you here in a room together tonight. I'm going to give you a little bit of background. What is CAR? CAR is our Creative Admin Research Program. This is something that we've been able to continue to develop over the last 3 years because of the generous lead support from the Mellon Foundation. Yes. It takes a village, y'all. And so as part of this, it's based on one single premise. There isn't one way of making art. So there also shouldn't be just one way of doing art business. And I said something last year, and I'm going to repeat it, because as we know, when you practice something is the only way to get to progress. Practice makes progress. And last year I reminded us that a tax distinction, like being a nonprofit organization, is just that, a tax distinction in code. It is not an operating model. When you stop yourself to thinking, well, I'm not for profit, then you know what you're not for. So instead of just relying on our tax distinction, let's ask ourselves the questions, what are we for? What are we working towards? How can we ask different questions instead of seeking the same answers over and over again? And I'm really excited. Some of you are a little insider, and you know. Thank you, Aaron, for this very graceful backwards working. So, some of you know and are a part, we have a national summit convening here in Akron this weekend. And what the CAR program has become is a think tank of 19 artist teams who all hail from 14 different states. That's the national part of the National Center for Choreography. And having all of them in the space together, who've been doing this work mostly remotely, to be able to compare lessons learned, to be able to commiserate on some of the same challenges so they can let go of those questions and complaints and find out what else is out there, what other things do they want to try, and making that a part of it as well. Our CAR work is centered in investigative retreats, which also have been nicknamed administrative therapy. Everyone has a different relationship and a different journey that they're going through as they're moving on as part of that. And during our investigative retreats, we do an art moment, because we can talk about it all day long, we can write about it all day long, but especially from a place of dance, we're movers. Movers first and foremost. And so it's wonderful when we can move together, when we can then process and experience and translate that into our administrative thinking. So that's the why many of us are here this evening. All right, and Sarah's telling me to find some light. Don't worry, I'm not going to start over. Will I still be in the light when I get on the chair? We'll see. That's fine. It's more important that you hear. So to kick off tonight, thank you also to John and the Akron Art Museum team for inviting us to come and play. And how fortuitous that they have this exhibition with the Keith Haring work, Against All Odds. And being able to understand, to look back a little bit, what was it to make work during a pandemic in the 80s as opposed to today? How could we reflect on those lessons learned and what still holds true and might also be relatable as we continue to craft our own paths through this process? So please join me in welcoming Jeff Katzin to the stage, curator here at the Akron Art Museum. Do you want to sit there? And everyone else's line would be, you're on mute, if this was a Zoom meeting.
I'd like to think that I said you're on mute more often than I heard it said to me. So that's a good batting average.
It's true. So, Jeff, to start us off, how did Against All Odds and this particular exhibition around Keith Haring's work come to fruition?
Sure. In an unusual fashion for a museum. First of all, the Akron Art Museum was founded as the Akron Art Institute just over 100 years ago, back in 1922. Back then we had more of a teaching focus, and we shifted over time toward museum exhibition display. Since that's just about 100 years ago, we were celebrating our centennial, and actually still are, have been doing it over 2022 and 23. And so I felt, once our previous senior curator, Jared Ledesma, left for a new position in North Carolina at a very cool museum, and it suddenly fell to me to figure out what we were going to do during this celebratory centennial period with a fairly large exhibition slot from April to September that really hadn't had any planning done yet. I admit, I had about 8 months to figure out a show and was kind of scrambling because museums tend to have 3 or more years to do something like that. So what I found, actually through a member of our design team who knows the Miami area pretty well, he said the Rubel Museum in Miami, Florida, there you go, some Miami.
Miami's in the house.
Yeah, Miami. That they are an interestingly organized private museum. They have some segments of their collection that they send out to travel and can do it a little more quickly than a regular nonprofit museum that normally would take, again, that sort of multi-year time span. So get in touch with them. And I looked at their list of exhibitions, and there were a number of very interesting things, but as I went down and down and down into what they traveled in the 2000 aughts, saw that they had a Keith Haring show. And that, I thought, would be a wonderful draw and exciting show at this time when we're really trying to be at our best, celebrating our 100th birthday, emerging from the pandemic, and to really do something wonderful and exciting. And in the process, I won't say the specific number, but our budget for this exhibition slot was X, and I convinced everyone that we should do X times 3.5.
Excellent.
To bring the Haring show. My favorite part, I don't know if she likes me quoting this or not, but I do it often and have done it in front of her. Our director of advancement said, "Don't let money be the reason why this show doesn't happen." And that, as a curator, was amazing empowerment. And so that, from the Rubel collection, was about 80 of the 120 or so objects in the show. And from the point where we signed that contract, it was just a constant push to add more loans, more works, because when you have Haring's stuff, it's so full of energy, it's so dense, and we wanted a show that would match those qualities and really fill our space in a full-bodied kind of a way. Yes.
And you mentioned the energy and the denseness. When we talked, it was this liveness. And as someone who grew up in the 80s, and I don't even know I could have named Haring, but it does feel like the Dancing Man and the Barking Dog have been in my life forever. And I recognize that as much as I do dance steps. What I was surprised to find out in our conversations together is how much Haring would draw live without a sketch. And that felt very similar to dance when you are literally moving, but we rehearse at least. But can you talk a little bit about the liveness in how Haring approaches his work?
Yeah.
Or did?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for him, and I'm sure I'll talk more about it, the situation of doing his work was at times more important than the content of the work or where he was going to end up, like putting himself in the right place and the right mindset. So there's a lot of different things that feed into that liveness as a quality. One is that he only started doing the really recognizable work that is represented in our show and that you would have grown up with, and that I grew up with a poster at my family's kitchen table for a while until it faded because we had it there long enough. He got there via a time in art school where he was doing performance art, abstraction, and video art. And all of that really had a lot to do with action in real time. Even the abstract art sometimes became a performance. One of his early pieces was one where he called it Painting Myself into a Corner, and he stood on a canvas and painted until he couldn't walk anymore without stepping on his painting. Or he liked to keep his studio door open and have people from the street in New York City wander in and end up in conversations with him and watch him work and do it all in real time. That was a whole constellation of things that he enjoyed and really wanted to make sure to keep going throughout his work. As far as working without a plan or a sketch, never. He never had a plan for what he was going to do before he did it. And yet he had this amazing, I think uncanny ability to start at the corner of a wall or a sheet of paper or whatever he was working on and get to the opposite corner and have everything come out even in weight and distribution and look as if it had to have been planned, but it wasn't. That was amazing. And then the last thing I'll mention is that he wanted to work so quickly that his experience of the world around him would flow right through him, and that he would not really mediate it, that he wouldn't have time to think about it and conceptualize it. He would just be a vessel or a conduit for the world around him to be expressed, and this way of working quickly without a plan was the only way for that to be possible.
And one of the highlights of the show upstairs are these subway drawings, which when you talk about, throwing open the door to the studio, inviting the public in, and also being a part of the world around him. Can you talk a little bit about how the subway drawings, because I would imagine that's a permitting nightmare in today's age when you're like, I'm going to go down and draw on public transit. Is that something that he was only able to do in the 80s? How did it come about?
Yeah, this again is something that's a whole constellation of things. One is he was in a circle or in New York City at the time of a number of other artists, like he would name Jenny Holzer, John Ahern, artists who in different ways were taking their practice directly to the public at street level, and that's something that he really realized that he wanted to do. Ultimately, his biggest goal and greatest motivation was to reach the largest possible audience. So he has this idea of wanting to do art in public places. He's also following graffiti. He's really impressed with graffiti as an element of black culture in New York, hip-hop culture, and he's really a fan. He knows that he's not a native New Yorker. He's a white kid from Pennsylvania. He's something of an outsider in that culture. And so he wants to do something like it, but respectfully adjacent to it. And all of this sort of swirls together into a moment when he's on a subway platform in New York City and sees not the subway car, which is a graffiti spot, but an advertisement board on the wall of a subway platform, which when the advertisements were out of date and you're waiting for a new advertisement to come in, but you don't want to give the previous person free time visible, you want people to pay for their advertising space, the companies would just put a black sheet of paper temporarily over and then layer a new ad on top of it and then layer another black sheet of paper and just keep building it up. But when there was that blank black sheet, he realized that's an empty space that I can fill with some drawing. And so in a moment of inspiration, he ran up to street level, grabbed a piece of chalk, ran back down, and just did the drawing. No permitting involved. He, between 1980, when he started that in 1985, did over 5,000 drawings in the New York subway. And that's how he became someone who was known to people, like you said, without knowing his name, because he never signed any of these drawings, but the dancing figures, the crawling babies, barking dogs, and just the general style were so recognizable that people knew that one person was behind all of this. He got over 100 tickets and got arrested at least once. He would talk about how he knew, like, he was trying to avoid being harassed by the police. And I mean, there was a graffiti artist, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, who was killed by the police, a black artist, around the time, and Haring was really moved by that incident and concerned about it. It wasn't like just trivial and just a matter of like people giving you a hard time. So he appreciated that he had to work quickly. He appreciated the feel of the paper and using the chalk. He liked to have people around watching him. That entire, like I said, that circumstance was really perfect for what it was that he was trying to do, which was work quickly, learn by doing, interact with people, produce art with somewhat universal messages that would reach a really, really large audience. The strategy of it turned out to be maybe the most brilliant thing.
Well, and I remember you also saying that his idea of documentation was not the finished work itself, but a picture of him doing the work. That idea of documentation, that also feels like the liveness of the body, of the participation, that it's not about the product, but it's about the process and the context, him being of the world. But why did he stop doing subway drawings?
Oh, that really makes it even harder on me. Because I was going to have to explain why it is that the proper thing in Haring's mind was not to preserve the drawings themselves, and yet we have a whole bunch of examples upstairs. So he thought of the drawings very much as performances. Not more as a performance probably than as a drawing. It's both, but it's especially a performance because it's about doing the work in a particular place in real time and having people see the work in a specific context and a specific location. It's not that it was wrong of someone to come upon the work after he had made it, but he also knew that it was going to get plastered over with a new poster within hours or days. So it was never meant to be preserved. Nevertheless, originally, just fans and people who wanted to participate in the art scene of New York started cutting down the drawings and preserving them. And then as his gallery fine art world career took off and his stuff was selling for tens of thousands of dollars or more, people realized there's value in this, and eventually by 1985, he would make a drawing and it would almost immediately get cut down off the wall, and that is what stopped the practice.
But he did still want to be brought straight to the people, so he did pop-up shops, right? And you've recreated what a pop-up shop could be upstairs as well.
Or the Pop Shop was the name,
Okay.
yeah. And it actually was less of a pop-up, and it lasted for quite a while, even past his death, which is an interesting thing unto itself. But he created the Pop Shop in Chelsea and Manhattan in 1986, stopped the subway drawings in 1985, and like you said, he was really concerned about how is it that everyday people who can't afford the gallery prices for something that I'm doing on canvas or even a drawing, how can I continue to connect to as many people as possible? And merchandising was really, for him, a way to do that. And where many artists would see that as some kind of a compromise, because I think his work was so rooted in reaching large audiences, for him it was very natural. Even to the point where he, in all likelihood, was more comfortable selling someone a t-shirt or a button or a poster for two figures, probably, I think some of the posters were really cheap. It was like under $10 for a poster, something like that. It might have been even less.
Don't tell the gift shop.
These are 1980s prices, I guess. I think it was like a couple dollars. I think it was really low. I found a price just recently, and I can't remember it specifically, but I was surprised, even accounting for inflation. But he was more comfortable with that than selling something to someone who had the budget to buy a painting for $30,000 in the 1980s. And so it was a shop with all of these really pretty simple items. And as we've sort of recreated upstairs, the space was a work of art unto itself, where he painted it floor, wall, ceiling. He pinned all of the different products to the walls, and then you'd go to a window to ask for it. So that became a visual display. And he did the whole thing really masterfully.
And in our car work, we're always looking for what's passive income? What are alternative revenue streams, so we don't default to just ticket sales and grants and classes? And we'll talk a little bit about the politics of Haring's work with our next guest as well. But from a business standpoint, can you talk about the sort of foresight and vision for him to develop an eponymous foundation that still handles licensing today?
Yeah. So Haring was working at the height of the AIDS epidemic. He essentially knew, he always figured that he was going to die young in some fashion or another. Eventually he realized it was likely to be from that disease. And that was not what he had bargained for. But he was diagnosed with HIV in, I think, 1987, and AIDS in 1988, and he died in early 1990 at the age of 31. And so he made the incredible impact that he did in really just a 10-year span of the height of his career, which is amazing. And knowing that his life was going to be cut short did give him an opportunity to plan. And so in the late 1980s, he created the Keith Haring Foundation. And artists typically create a foundation with the money that they've earned over the course of their career, if they are lucky enough to, bring in enough, with the artwork that they have not yet sold, if they're lucky enough for that to be worth a sufficient amount. And those are the things that sort of sustain a foundation. But with Haring, the additional element of merchandising and licensing is possibly the most valuable thing that he bestowed upon the foundation. So the Pop Shop stayed in operation after his death and all the way till 2005. And then now, I think really over the last 10 or so years, there's been a resurgence of brands collaborating with the foundation to create Keith Haring merchandise. And the reason why I find it so fun to, I've got my pin and my shirt and my shoes here, so I'm geared up with Keith Haring, is not just because it fits his art so well, but because the foundation exists to take a portion of those sales and put it toward the charitable enterprises that really mattered to Haring, which are education, prevention, and research related to AIDS, and charities that support children. And so I don't necessarily mean to be a cynical museum person telling you to exit through the gift shop, but there is good done by the merchandise, which is a major part of his legacy, and in an unusual way.
I mean, you have options at the Akron Art Museum, and I think some of the brands today, this season, Gap and Old Navy, have Haring t-shirts and things. So you have your choice which gift shop you want to exit through. We're going to talk some more, but to introduce our next artist, I actually will invite Aaron and the Akron Art Museum team to bring down the film screen, and we have a brief video before we all come back.
The work is hybrid, and the same way that I kind of question my sense of being many different things as well. Like I'm a Kenyan, I'm an Indian, I'm a Canadian, I'm an American, but I'm also a punk rock ballerina, and I think that's also kind of fun and interesting, and it kind of creates complications. I work between the intersections of dance and visual arts, and my work includes performance, sculpture, film, and video. I became an artist, I think, by birth. I think as a child I always was inclined to dancing, to making drawings and paintings, and I think it's just something that I kind of cultivated as I grew up. My parents were always, again, supportive of it, but they never thought it would become like a career path for me. I think that's partially because we're immigrants. My family is fifth generation Kenyans, Kenyan Indians, and we moved to Canada in 1989. And when we moved to Canada, that's when I also started to feel more expression of the arts and culture, because the school system allowed for that. When I moved to Canada, I started dancing, taking like classes at local schools, and again, I always said I was inclined to drawing and painting, and so like throughout my my childhood into my teenhood, I was making both. Towards the end of my career, I guess because I got injured, my dance career, I was like kind of like taken by the way that my this form of dance, something that I really wanted to do and pursue, kind of like it kind of rejected me. So I felt a little bit like, oh boy, what am I going to do now? So I really focused then on visual art. Then when I moved to New York in, 2005, I went to New York to study at the Whitney Independent Study Program. But I started seeing dance again, and I was like, maybe I still like you. We had this kind of like breakup, physically my injury, which was a hamstring injury, but also I think this idea of you betrayed me. So I went back to being like, we're now kind of becoming a relationship again. And so I started seeing more dance, not taking classes, but like seeing dance and being excited by it again. And that's when I started to kind of do more, kind of like thinking like, okay, I'll bring in bodies into my work, and starting to make this narrative and this connection to like dance and labor, dance and the colonial body, and specifically looking at ballet. I'm not dancing on a stage myself, but I'm making dance, and for me that becomes a really beautiful space of community and collaboration, and that's a big part of my work, is to kind of give that space to each other. We create agency, and I really question in my work a lot how dancers have choice in my work, where when I was a dancer, we were just told what to do. And so in my process, it's about a community, it's about collaboration, it's about dialogue, and I think that's a big part of how I frame and make my dances. I'm really curious about how dance doesn't have a language. Dance, even if it's scored, even if it's choreographed like a classical ballet, it's never going to be the same. Performance is always going to change, and you never know what's going to happen. I don't like things to be static. I like things to be in flux, and to find that kind of challenge within it. And I also my work never is on a stage. My work is always in a public space, or a museum. And so it's the kind of idea of the moving body becomes the sculpture. For me, stillness in my dances is very important. So I believe that within stillness, a body that couldn't be moving, in stillness, it's still moving. So the labor gesture is still there. So if you're holding your hand like this, I'm still moving. There's never a moment of being pure static, right? And so that's within the moving body, and I think that's really interesting because it's still an action that within this kind of like capitalist space, it feels like the body's being lazy or idle or not working. And so within the work, there is this social political question that I'm kind of bringing up all the time. And I think for me, dance is political. Dance is a means to, for protest. And, I've been thinking a lot about how protest is, not necessarily just, marching down, on a street, which I do, But my work in itself is a form of protest. And so there's a different form. But within it, it's still looking for the same questions of like freedom. I also look within my work at the masochistic qualities that we endure or express as dancers. Like, you just keep doing things, and within my proposals, I'll give them choices to say, like, they can stop whenever they want. And I'm referring specifically to the Master and Form. The Master and Form was a piece that I started at the Graham Foundation in Chicago, and it became the piece that represented me at the Whitney Biennial in 2019. It's a really important piece for me for many reasons. It made me think a lot about, again, the ballet body, the questions of masochism, the mastery of the body. Because, within ballet technique, it's a technical body that is performing. And I question it against, my technical body that wasn't seen as being the perfect body or the body that is allowed to be ballet. And so within this work, I'm also critiquing and decolonizing and dismantling the kind of system, but also, respecting the history and the ideas of what ballet is. And the Master and Form, started with making these kind of like wooden medieval devices that seem like kind of beautiful, like aesthetic kind of tools or furniture or anthropomorphic kind of sculptures, but they're actually these objects that put ballet dancers into perfect ballet positions. And then within it, I asked in the proposal that they stay in there for as long as they can. And there's this moment where, like on the devices, there's these wooden pieces, but wherever the body touches, there's like sewn leather onto them, so that there's these, kind of like intimacy between skin to skin. And, the piece starts with the dancers all in these devices. They walk into the space, and then they sit in these devices, and they're just holding it. And they're holding it for as long as they can. And then, and then eventually the body has to fatigue, and then they fall out of it. When they fall out, then it becomes a moment of like invigorating the body, and then getting back into it. It's hard. It's hard labor. I definitely put my dancers through a lot. For me, that's also political space. The idea of like resilience, even the idea of like falling out of the object and going back into it. In my work, you'll see a lot of this idea of like falling and standing up again. So the idea of to fall as a moment of like vulnerability, fragility, but then the political action to stand up. So even within the Master and Form, there's this idea that they fall out. They don't like fall out like in the sense of like a fall and hit and situation, but they fall out and then they come back to it again. So that's like, for me, is also like a political strategy that I kind of use a lot in my work. My earlier work in my master's degree was looking at that colonial history, but also looking at it through like this idea of nostalgia, the idea of making home, where's home? And I started to make kind of questions between the souvenir and the artifact. So the objects in the museum versus the souvenir that people would buy and take home as trinkets. I think a lot about how masks were all performed. In the piece Stand Taller, you see a number of kind of like gesture drawings in a space. And they kind of look like dancers. But what they really are actually the mounts that hold masks. So in my work, I'm looking at a lot about the lost bodies of West African masks that were taken away from their place of origin by the colonizers. The French colonized parts of West Africa when they took masks from the continent and brought them into the European context and placed them in museums. We took away the dances. And so you have these plinths that are stand-in for the bodies, but then you have these mounts that hold them on the plinth. So the support, the device that carries them. And I started to look at them because I'm always like working in museum collections, and I'm like, these little supports look like little people moving. And so in Stand Taller, you see a number of the mounts enlarged, and then they just become these kind of like larger, graceful kind of like motions. And so I kind of just like the idea that they're holding the mask, the kind of, there's no mask there, but it's also really then inflects this idea of like a body. And so in a lot of my work, I've been thinking about how the lost bodies of these objects and trying to bring back the dance. And so going back to ballet, ballet is a French institution as well. Ballet began as a way to bow to Louis XIV. Louis XIV, choreographed his court. When his court came to him, they had to like bow in certain gestures to the king. And the deeper you bow, the lower class you are. And so thinking about that, ballet then became a dance form, and Louis XIV himself actually performed ballet. And ballet was Baroque, these kind of like very like Baroque gestures. And then the different courts in the European continent started to adopt ballet as the dance of the kings. And so what we see ballet as today is what the Russian court created. But I'm still sort of thinking about that kind of that Western hierarchy, that Western hegemony, and how that kind of is, counterculture to the West African masquerade. You have this kind of like civilized kind of dance of ballet, body's like rigid, but in West African dance, you're breaking the spine, you're moving your body in certain ways. And I'm creating that juxtaposition of like, the cultured and the othered. Within all of my work, I'm trying to like, when I'm saying it's in flux, that it's challenged and changing, it's about trying to find new forms. So even within that question of protest and finding freedoms, the freedom is finding that new imagined possibility of how do we live, how do we exist, how do we support each other. So it's about this kind of collectivity, gathering, supporting, nurture, care, giving through critical mass to find solidarity, to find that new freedom, to find that new form of existing. So the Calls for me was a piece that is being performed by the DR Vocal Ensemble, composed by Nils Rosenshaw, and costumes by Hendrik Wispo. And the piece came to me kind of in a moment of like a moment where I just didn't know what to do anymore. At the time, Chicago was a very charged city. The city was going through, like, we were in lockdown, but people were on the streets marching, protesting against, Black Lives Matter. And in the night, I would just be sleeping and trying to sleep, but always this kind of heavy, kind of like uncertain sleep where I could just hear the sounds of police sirens, the sounds kind of like taking over the streets, and a presence. But I was like, is this actually supporting my body? Is this sort of acknowledging just a presence of like, we're here, but we're not going to, like, what is happening here? And, for me, police have never really supported my body. I'm questioning that space of authority. And so when Catherine Lefebvre asked me to kind of come and do something, here in Copenhagen, I started thinking about, I want to make a song, a protest song, a song that speaks to this idea of, police abolition, this idea of like dismantling hierarchies. And so here we come together and we're making this political song where we're singing the sounds of police sirens, but also singing these lyrics about being seen, being heard, but also becoming invisible. Like this kind of this calling out that we're like yelling and screaming, but we're also saying like we're coming together as many bodies to sing as one voice. And when we put all our voices together, there's that really powerful moment. And the piece is like, Nils, who's composing it, made this beautiful kind of like work where he understood my concepts, but it's like sometimes it's very like pretty, but sometimes it's this kind of like noise, and you're kind of like, what is this? Like, and so you have the choir kind of all performing, and they're like singing against each other, but then they're also singing at the end as one. And it's kind of this beautiful moment of like, we're calling out to say we need to find solidarity. Free Fall for Camera is a piece that comes out of like many other pieces. In the summer of 2015, it seems so long ago, I was just curious about, as I mentioned, this idea of like falling and standing up again. And so I was playing in a studio with a dancer, Rachel Myers from Ballet BC. We were in a studio, and I was just playing a game of like call and response. I would be like dance, 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 fall, and then she'd fall. And I wanted to see how do we choreograph a fall? How does the body fall to the ground and then stand up again? And how do I make the body fall but not let it get hurt? And then, in the summer of 2016, the Pulse Orlando massacre happened. And it was this moment of like distraught, because outside of ballet, outside of like formal dance, and then outside of cultural dance, the dance club for me as a queer POC was something that was really important. It was a space of freedom, it was a space of sanctuary. And so I really was taken. And then I started thinking that this fall of the body in that rehearsal or that process with Rachel was kind of had more sentiment, had more meaning, had more vulnerability to me. And I always say that I wish this piece wasn't relevant, but it still is in the fact that we're still having violence in nightclubs, we're still having violence against queers, we're still having violence against people of color, and it's a piece that's supposed to respond to that, to create space, to create agency, but to also it's a memoriam for these people. And so in Free Fall 49, the live performance, you have dancers dancing on kind of pedestals, and we create a dance party. So people come and gather and they're dancing, and then we have a big screen that counts up the numbers, but there's a sound cue that plays, and then the dancers hold their bodies and then they fall to the ground. So and then we stop the party. And we do that 49 times in honor, in ode to the fallen 49 of the Pulse Orlando massacre. In Free Fall for Camera, I'm thinking about, Busby Berkeley, the Hollywood filmmaker that filmed from above. And when the dancers, performers would fall, they kind of create these kind of glamorous kind of like actions with fans and sparkles. And I was just thinking, let's have the bodies fall. They keep on falling on the floor and making these kind of kaleidoscopic, formations with their bodies, and it was kind of morphing and changing, and then it would stand up again and then it would fall again, thinking again about this idea of standing and falling. But it was also thinking about the cinematic, thinking about the camera. The camera for me in dance is such an important device. It captures, it archives, but it's also a device that choreographs. The way the camera moves itself is doing its own dance, and so the piece is acknowledging the history and of Pulse Orlando, but it's also kind of using it, kind of creating this aesthetic kind of document, this idea of like the fallen body, and it's in a different type of glamour space, to kind of like question that political space as well. I think what I hope for in my work is that my audience comes together, that they find a space of inclusivity, that they find a space that they can find their narrative to be part of. Because my narrative is specific to me, but it's also a narrative that everyone shares. And so I really want to find a way to kind of break down those binaries, to break down those fractures, to not make separations, but to be more inclusive. And that for me is a queer space. And I think about queer as a moniker of inclusivity and, and to break down those binaries, as I mentioned. And it's not necessarily about like gender or just sexuality. It's about, about a space, about, finding those ways that we can all self-include and communicate and collaborate. And for me, that's a deeper way of understanding society.
NCCAkron and Akron Art Museum friends, please join me in welcoming Brendan Fernandes to the stage.
Thank you. Really appreciate everyone being here, and super excited to jump into this conversation. You guys started such a robust dialogue, so I'm going to help hopefully contribute. I just have to say, I haven't seen that before, and I don't like seeing myself on camera, so I'm feeling a little anxious right now, but it's fine.
Well, maybe we start there with how you would define documentation of your work. There's such a liveness because you are bringing bodies and performance. You said it yourself, you don't perform on stages. But does your work exist in museum spaces without the dancer bodies?
Interesting. Okay. No, I think the work has to have some sense of activation, engagement with a living body. It doesn't have to be a dancer per se, it could be the audience. And as much as I make, sculptural installations, you might have seen some of them in that video, it's asking for bodies to be present in it. So whether it's something that I've choreographed with trained dancers, or if it's something for my audience, I'm kind of creating like dance scores with my sculptural intervention. So I always say when I make my installations that I'm making playgrounds, that they're spaces that you can explore as dancers, but also as an audience, you're also asked to participate and kind of follow a specific kind of trajectory or artery within the space. But the body has to be there. The body is always going to be a major part of what activates the work.
Yeah, whether they're dancers or I loved in our prep talk when you said like sometimes the audience are the dancers and performers, how they interact with the space as well.
I'm doing a show that's opening in Philadelphia at the Barnes Foundation, and one of the curators was like, because we have set performances happening in the space, and I was saying, that part of my work for that exhibition is the museum design. Like I've designed the space with the museum design team. And then there'll be a performance that the dancers will explore within that space. But one of the curators was like, well, when the dance ends, what happens to the space? And I'm like, well, the dance doesn't end. The dance will continue with the way that an audience member will move in the space. Like I'm making pathways. And for me, that's something that I've been thinking a lot about as ways of dismantling like systems and institutions. Like I'm metaphorically thinking that to make new doorways, windows, and pathways is a way to dismantle the institution, but to create new ways of moving in a space. And so I try to create trajectories, to kind of ask you to move in this way. And even that for me is like political language, to move forward, to move in this way, to move in a new way. So that's kind of part of the kind of audience participation as well.
Thinking about Keith Haring as a political statement with his work, and then how do you relate also to politics more in your own work today?
Well, through lived experiences, through, I look a lot at the colonial body, looking at my history with ballet as a ballet dancer. My parents, I'm an immigrant from Kenya. My parents brought me to Canada when I was 9 years old, and that's when I found dance, but I found ballet as a community, which was interesting for me. That then became a moment of, kind of like stoppage when the ballet world didn't like my body, and specifically my feet. They didn't like my feet. So I kind of look at the ways of dismantling those structures those power dynamics. Right now, I think, pandemic-wise, thinking about how do I move together? How do we move? How do we make community? How do we do this? In my work, when I say my dance work is protest, it's about a protest of bringing collectivity, bringing people together to form a solidarity. So a lot of my work sometimes becomes a dance party where we end up all just communicating and dancing with each other through that kind of bodily language. And for me, a celebration in my family is when we're together, when we are celebrating, we dance. And so for me, that kind of joyous space is also a way of being a political protest. Another way that I think about it is just through the residue of hardship and the labor that comes from things like Black Lives Matter. Like during the pandemic, like putting on a mask and being scared that I might contract a virus and get sick, but I'm going to go out there and be seen and be heard. So a lot of my work comes from that, and I think that's something that Keith Haring was also trying to do in his work. And I identify as a queer POC, and I think within that work, being like marginalized or countercultured from an everyday culture, I think that is where there's a similarity. He was making space for his community within a pandemic when we couldn't there was a president that wouldn't say the words AIDS, so silence equals death, and those are still things that we're still fighting for. Those civil rights are still things that we're trying to engage within within many queer communities still.
And it's not enough. I think sometimes people will say to artists, like, oh, you should do it because you're passionate. You should do it. And it's like, oh, no, I also like to pay the bills. And so I also am curious for everyone to hear more about, so what is the company, the ecosystem? Because you were trained in a very 20th century single choreographer company. Is a lot of your lived experience as well. And you have built out a different sense of company and ecosystem that also isn't limited to just one city.
Yeah, and I think that for me, it's that kind of like, again, community spirit of like working with, people always say to me like, how do you find your dancers? And I'm like, well, so-and-so danced in this company or did this piece, and then so-and-so told me to move with this. Like, even like today I was talking to my friend Allison, who used to dance with Ballet Next and Joffrey, and I was like, I'm doing this thing in Philadelphia, who do you suggest? So I feel like as dance makers and dance people, and we kind of just have that kind of ethos of having community engagement. Like, we are a core. We are a body that kind of moves together, and so we also support that, and I think that's something that's really important to me. So obviously, I have dancers that I keep working with because the method to my madness is sometimes, it's complicated, and so they get my madness, and they agree to participate again. So I work with certain dancers that know what I ask them to do, but I definitely have like a group in Chicago, New York, and Toronto, and LA. But when I'm working with others in other cities, it's always like an engagement asking my community, like, oh, I did an intensive with so-and-so, they're great. And I just love that's the way we kind of find each other. Like, it's a really, instead of doing auditions and putting calls out, it's just kind of going to within the community.
Well, it's very human to human, but I'm also curious, I want the receipts. I'm curious to the specifics. You had made a comment like, for 6 months out of the year, I'm trying to keep a company. What does that mean when so much of today's dance landscape is working on a project-to-project basis?
I think it's like the sustainability is something that I try to, I think working with museums is different too. There's a different way of like gaining funding or how we pay our dancers. I always try to pay way above what we can, always applying for grants and so things like that. But I think that when there is, finances from like specific kinds of donors or, sales as well, because when I make things, it also becomes commodifiable.
The sculptures
or the films that I make, and so there's those things that I make, which are definitely part of the practice and are conceptual, but also then help support the practice as well when it comes to the liveness of it. So I always say my work is intersectional, that it's between visual arts and dance, and sometimes that hybridity is confusing for people and I kind of like to play with that, and sometimes it doesn't work in my favor because sometimes I'll apply for a grant and they'll say, well, you're not a dance artist, you're a visual artist, and I hate those binaries. I think that's something as well that I'm trying to, to dismantle, but the work is that it kind of flips. It's in between, and I'm in between. In the sense of, so my work is also in between.
If you want to hand that to Jeff, a couple of months ago, the Akron Art Museum brought in a consultant, Andras, who talked about. Yes, we're at a moment, particularly with museums and predominantly white-led institutions, that are needing to change, can't change fast enough. But he also had pointed out that 100 years ago, museums also needed to change. And it was because they heard from artists that then left an impact on what became the museums that we know today, like the Guggenheim, the more round spaces instead of the squares and the salons. I'm really curious, Jeff, has there been an impact of Keith Haring's work that has changed the museum institutions?
Yeah, I think that I mentioned earlier the generation that he was part of, where artists were interested in taking work directly to the public and showing it in non-traditional spaces. It was an interesting transition for Haring to go from being the guy who would do drawings in the New York subway to being someone who would also have works of art in museum exhibitions. And he was in a few group shows early in his career, but it was really a 1982 solo gallery exhibition at the Tony Shafrazi Gallery that sold out and really proved his place in the fine art world and started to give him momentum, probably later than he deserved it. And I mean, he had to really fight for the place of an art that would be doing all of these things at once, because the expectation was, if you're a museum fine art artist, then that makes sense. But if you're doing these other things, does your work really belong in a museum? It, again, just like Brendan was talking about, it's a matter of these categories which are meant to help us to understand the world, but ultimately prevent us from interfacing with the world directly. And museums are often places of categories, of art made from this time period or art made in this location. And Haring was, I think, one of many artists who have worked to try to say, just because I don't fit into this specific box doesn't mean that I don't belong in many places. And that skepticism of categories and the diminishing of their rigidity is important in so many ways, many of which are deeply political. So he really is an artist who I think helped to push that along.
So it also isn't a new binary challenge, Brendan, it sounds like. But when you talk about making work that dismantles institutions and systems of inequity, the continuation of that reminds me of we had a speaker last year, Mark Bimudi Joseph, who told us, we are trying for change now, but we also are becoming better arts ancestors so that those that come up after us hopefully don't have to face as many of these binaries and setting that up. So I am curious, in addition to the space, Brendan, if you want to grab the mic, because you've also explored, it's not just about where you want to locate your work, but finding creative ways to tackle very practical challenges. And I'm thinking particularly art by Snapchat. We didn't get to see a peek at that, but would you explain what is art by Snapchat for our audience?
Sure. Art by Snapchat was a piece where I was sort of looking at the kind of ideas of fluxism and the ways, again, of language and not having a dance language. And it was a piece that I choreographed based on a show at the Museum of Contemporary Art in the 60s called Art by Telephone, where Bruce Nauman would pick up a telephone and gain a directive from somebody, and then he would perform it. And so I decided to do a version called Art by Snapchat, where I was choreographing a corps of dancers in the Museum of Modern Art in New York through my telephone, giving them instructions, but also some of them being like political gestures, like turn around and become a monument. and then so they were kind of doing these things, but then just the kind of the choreography of like, your phone, like swiping left to right, became part of the gestures of the piece. But also the idea that, they were being like kind of very affected movements at certain times, and then their phone would buzz because I would be sending them another prompt, and then they would stop, kind of look at their phone, and that became part of the choreography. So I guess for me, that's about just like reinventing, using technologies to find ways to kind of.
But you also, like, you weren't even in the same city.
Oh yeah, I forgot to tell you that part.
Yeah.
Yes, I was in Vancouver. So I was in Vancouver sending them the messages on Snapchat, and then my phone was projected in one of the main spaces, and the dancers were just kind of moving around the space. And the one thing that was really interesting was people were trying to find me. They could see the dancers, but people were like, where's this person that's sending these directives? And like, I was in Vancouver.
I love that you were like, I'm not going to say no to the gig. I will find a way to make it happen.
It was my first time being invited by the MoMA, and I was like, I had to be in Vancouver for something, which was super important. And I was like, how do I do this? Mm-hmm. So I think resilience, resistance, is part of what I do. I think, during the pandemic, I wrote an article for Freeze magazine called Dancing in the Pandemic, because I didn't know, I didn't have purpose. I didn't have anything, I was feeling very, like all of us, I was feeling that I would never be able to make dance again or dance again. And so I started to think that, how do I take on this challenge and become resilient, resistant? And I started making this piece called The Left Space, which was a Zoom performance where I was thinking if we're all in the same filter, so I started designing these filters and this sort of like kind of like textile pattern, if we're all in the same space, in the Zoom land with the same filter, are we together? And then I choreographed something, and I never thought I would make anything on Zoom. I didn't even know what Zoom was, and at the time, and just exploring it. So I think for me, that's something that's really important, is to kind of challenge and push oneself. And when you talk about, creating space, now so that others can have more space, like I know that the work is never done. The work is not done. I will still labor to make the space, but I may not see the change that I want to see in my lifetime, but I'm hoping that it'll be enough that someone else, in the future can see that change. Mm-hmm. I've been thinking a lot about being invisible in my choreography. What does it mean to be invisible? And the space of being invisible for me is that I don't need to be seen and heard. Mm-hmm. So maybe getting into that utopic moment where I can't even imagine what that would be, but I've gained my civil rights and my community has gained their civil rights. I don't have to protest to say I'm here or listen to me. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of think about being invisible. So I've kind of been using that motif a lot in my newer choreographies.
I have one last question. Would love to hear from both of you. So, dealer's choice. I'm curious, because you are administrators, makers, curators, culture workers, and warriors in today's ecology, when do you choose to work with the system, and when do you choose to push against it?
I think that my way of answering that is kind of my way of describing my motivations as a curator, period, which are about my audience, which starts with the Akron community and radiates from there. And it's really a matter of what I get the sense that they need. And if I feel like I can't serve people by staying within a certain guideline or within a certain category or a certain practice, what's convenient is that I have a clear guiding light to say what a different direction is going to be. And I think that's basically the basis for it. I have basically felt out of step with the art history museum community in one way or another pretty much since I was in graduate school, and didn't necessarily like the professor-student power dynamics or the way that the language of theory and art history was often very styled toward an ivory tower, and I feel like all of that experience has brought me to a curatorial career with a particular sense of purpose. And it's not always that particular sense of purpose, and the things that motivate me are not always the things that motivate people in my field. And I think it's a matter of holding fast to that sense of conviction and purpose, and letting it be a guide.
And what a gift that you're also in a space like the Akron Art Museum where you can play with that a little bit too.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the moments where, as a curator, there's confidence placed in me as not just a logistical organizer of exhibitions, but as a creative person and as a storyteller, and as someone who's going to put information forward in a way that is understandable and relatable and even helpful for people, and to focus on what I'm afforded in that position and to see it as a responsibility to take advantage of it.
Brendan, I'll remind you of the question. When do you work with a system, and when do you choose to push against it?
So I think I define myself as a punk rock queer ballerina, and I think within that I've always been pushing systems through the challenges of being an immigrant, all that stuff. So I've always wanted to find change. I'm not happy in the system that we live in, but I will use the system against itself to make the change. So when I work in museums, I'm going to be heard and seen. I'm going to make those doorways and windows and pathways that define my way of moving. And so for me, it's very much about that. Like, I will take the system. Like, I will give, for example, my show at the Guggenheim. I made the Guggenheim into a BDSM sex club. And that was, a challenge for the system there. But like, that was a minor threat, but I will use the system in different ways to use it against itself. And then from that, to build and to create newness. And so for me, it's always a pushback, it's always me pushing the system, but finding change within that system that will allow me to feel empowered.
Yes. Excellent. Please give our speakers a round of applause. I will also offer my thanks once again to the Mellon Foundation for lead support around creative admin research, also to the National Endowment for the Arts for our programming, and as well to the GAR Foundation here in Akron, who helped us seed a special Akron cohort as well. I told you it takes a village. There's many more of you out there that made this possible too. Thank you for joining us tonight, and we look forward to seeing you upstairs in the galleries or the gift shop.